I guess I should do a little self-introduction. I'm David Hirsch, pronouns he, him, his. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist. I work at Marshfield Clinic. I've been doing that for about 14, 15 years. But I had two previous careers, which I think, I don't know, adds something to my life. I managed the Kinko's copies back in the day. And then after that, I was a software engineer and went back to school to get credentialed in computer science and found that I still had a passion for medicine, which I'd had back when I was a kid. So 11 and a half years of training is actually what it took to get from where I was as a software engineer to being a physician and a fully credentialed physician. So it was a long haul, and not something you do because you have the end result in mind, but something you do because you enjoy the journey. And so that was very important to me. And thank you very much to Tracy and family, Tim, for letting me do all that. Anyway, now to my printed out thing. First, I want to say how much I appreciate the opportunity to share some birth stories. There are a lot of things I love about my job, like, for example, I do gender-affirming hormone care. I talked about that over the summer. And some, of course, I don't. For example, I'm on call right now. But being able to be present for and help with births is the real and main reason I do what I do. The next thing I need to share is that I recognize that my perspective is limited. I am trained as a physician in Western medicine. There are as many different ways to give birth as there are births now. In the US, people typically give birth at home or in hospitals or on the way there with physicians or midwives assisting. But I can only really speak to my area of expertise, and I definitely recognize that the physician/hospital way of giving birth is not the only or even necessarily the best one. I'm also speaking from the perspective of a healthcare provider. Moms, parents, and families, of course, have their own intense reactions to the birth experience, but that's not mostly what I'm intending to address today. Speaking of being on call and a dad myself, I figure I get to make at least just one dad joke. Here it is. Recently, I got a call from a dad worried about his pregnant wife's behavior. He said, "Doc, I don't know what to do. My wife keeps shouting weird things like can't, shouldn't, she's, and won't." "Ah, okay," I replied. "How far along is she?" 39 weeks, he said. "No problem then," I explained. "How often is she contracting?" Might be time to get her to the hospital. Just the one. I'll save you the rest. The themes of today's talk are perhaps best illustrated by stories. Note that the stories I share are anonymous, both legally and morally. It is important to maintain the confidentiality of people's experiences as they interact with the medical system. And in fact, none of the stories I share directly involve me as a physician, kind of for the same reason. The first story happened back while I was in training in Milwaukee. The team called it the Christmas miracle because, as I recall, it happened right around Christmas time. I wasn't on the obstetric service. Like I say, I wasn't directly involved, but I was on the sideline for all this. I was on the oncology service, actually. Which, by the way, is the hardest service in residency, just in case you decide to go to OB/GYN residency. That's why I wasn't directly involved. The patient was a 26-year-old woman. She was giving birth to her third child. The delivery itself was uneventful, no problems. However, a few minutes after the placenta was delivered, she started having extremely heavy bleeding and became unresponsive. So she was experiencing what's called an amniotic fluid embolism. At least we assume that she was. This is kind of a poorly understood condition where the patient's entire blood volume kind of clots all at the same time. It's thought because amniotic fluid is being forced into the bloodstream, it's very irritating to the vessels, and so everything just kind of clots up. Huge inflammation everywhere in the body. So because she was essentially dying or dead at the time, we took her to the operating room and they administered CPR on and off for about 2 hours. which is a very long time to have CPR. At the same time, the team performed a hysterectomy to get at the source of the bleeding, and they gave her blood transfusions, about 4 or 5 or 6, I don't know, lots, many times over. Her entire blood supply was replaced with red blood cells, platelets, plasma. At the end of the procedure, she was alive. She had a heartbeat. CPR was not being performed. And so she was taken to the critical care unit next door on the breathing machine. And it was assumed that she would have little or no brain function after such a severe insult. I mean, 2 hours of CPR, the brain doesn't get really well perfused during this. And so it was thought she was gone, probably. And the thought was that her family would have a chance to come and say goodbye to her, and then they would turn off the machine, and then that would be that. The team, heartbroken and exhausted, went home at about 1 a.m. This is the day team from the previous day. The night team had arrived at like 7 p.m., but everybody stayed and worked. The day team went home to try to get a little rest before the next day started at 6 in the morning. The assumption, again, was that after her parents and the rest of her family had a chance to say goodbye, she would be allowed to pass. So in the morning, I logged into the hospital medical record system to kind of confirm the expected outcome. However, much to my surprise, there was no death note there. The first note in the system was a lactation consultation. So not only had she not died, but despite being intubated and sedated, which you have to be to endure having this thing down your throat, she was awake enough to receive instructions on how to nurse her newborn. And she went home 4 days later. I mean, it's astounding. Yeah, no kidding. So is this a miracle, right? Is it the Christmas miracle? Is it the amazing fight that parents always do demonstrate to survive and care for their children? Is it the physiologic reserve that young, healthy people have when faced with a severe insult to the body? That's one of the great blessings of my field, is that people can survive a lot of things when they're young and healthy. Is this the effective, rapid application of scientific intensive care and surgical principles? Well, of course, it's all of the above, right? It's all of the above. So to me, this story is an example of what I will call sublime. Sublime has several definitions. The one I'm attempting to evoke is the idea of the point where the medical science becomes transcendent, the point where the technical details of patient care become an experience of awe, joy, and in some cases, despair. A dictionary definition consistent with this would be that something that is transcendent goes beyond normal limits or boundaries because it is more significant than them. So sublime and transcendent have similar meanings. In a peer-reviewed research article titled Transcendence and Sublime Experience in Nature, Awe and Inspiring Energy, this was published in Frontiers of Psychology. So authors Elizabeth Bethelmy and Jose Codroziza discuss different philosophers' approaches to understanding the sublime. Going back to Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant in the 1700s, the sublime was defined as emotion characterized by astonishment, awe, fear, respect, and admiration. That's Edmund Burke. And the sort of feeling that stirs the soul, whether due to surprise, terror, reverence, magnificence, trembling, or respect. That's Immanuel Kant. Abraham Maslow, who's a famous researcher and psychologist, in 1964 described self-transcendence as a peak experience, a larger-than-life experience of self-realization characterized by a mix of spiritual emotions like enlightenment, awe, reverence, humility, happiness, wonder, and connection to the universe, among others. Kind of on the flip side, author Britta Bushnell, in her 2020 book, Transformed by Birth, Cultivating Openness, Resilience, and Strength for the Life-Changing Journey from Pregnancy to Parenthood, she reminds us that, quote, birth, while transcendent, otherworldly, spiritual, and profound, is actually intense hard work that tests our ideas of what spiritual looks like and means. Birth exposes the sacred through the muck, mud, and hardship of something so profoundly animalistic that it makes us into something entirely new. This otherworldly place where great transformation happens is the sacred space of birth. In other words, she's arguing from the other direction, spiritual to physical, but it works both ways. And that's the sublime, right? It's on both sides and they meet. Another quote from her book that I like: "When we enter the world of birth, we step across the threshold from the mundane to the sacred. Pregnancy and birth are a space between worlds, a liminal space, a place where you are no longer not a parent and not yet one either. This betwixt and between is sacred space within which powerful and profound events occur, often uninvited." Historically, and in the present, a birth represents not just a new human life, but a new soul, right? So the idea of the transcendent nature of birth is hardly new, but one doesn't have to believe in an eternal soul, which I don't, to understand the spiritual significance of that new life, the possibilities for it, what it means to the family and its parents, and what the new person's future holds. You see that all kind of stretched out for you when you see a brand new baby. But not every baby makes it. And this too leads to transcendence, to sublime pain. To illustrate the fear and despair side of this coin, I'd like to read a brief essay written by one of my residency colleagues. Her name is Jacinia Magua. She was a couple of years ahead of me in residency. And she's from Florida. She's of Cuban descent. She lives in Florida. Florida, there's some words in here what she writes about the legal aspect of it, which is very understandable from Florida, because Florida is very, very litigious. Anyway, so I assume she wrote this in response to, and probably shortly after, a specific experience in her life as an obstetrician. But honestly, we've all been there. Everybody who provides care, everyone involved in the delivery of birthing services has been through this kind of disaster. And we'll offer a warning. This is difficult to listen to, but of course, way more difficult to experience. Here's what she writes. "You can be a good doctor, a great doctor. You know your stuff and have good instincts about labor. Your patients love you and trust you, and you have pulled off miracles with crashing babies in limited time. You can make a series of correct decisions that, had you to do them again, you would probably repeat. You can do everything correctly, and babies can still die. And that moment shatters you. It changes you. You lose the innocent mindset that we learned in residency that says, if you're fast enough, good enough, well-trained enough, you can get a baby out in time. You can call a cesarean section early enough. You can forceps or vacuum that baby right out, and it'll all be good. If we didn't have that belief in ourselves, how could we function? But then the unthinkable happens, and we stand utterly alone, transfixed in our grief and shame, and realize that no, we are not always enough. Our shame and guilt after the loss isolates us from our colleagues, even the kind ones who reassure us that we did nothing wrong. It makes us dread every phone call from risk management or the hospital attorney. Makes us check our mail by hand for letters requesting records. Worst of all, it isolates us from the parents whose grief we can't even begin to comprehend. And our words of regret and consolation are stilted. It isolates us from our family. How can they, non-medical folk, understand that at the core of my being, I feel that this baby would be alive if I'd been able to do better? This baby that kicked at me through mom's belly during labor, back when things were happier, back before it all went wrong. So, Now that we see that the emperor has no clothes, we are forced to go back to the same places where this happened. Same labor room, same OR, same nurses on shift. And now we are in those places no longer feeling invincible and powerful, but indecisive and powerless. Because we know one thing for certain: we can't lose another baby. It will be the end of us. The still slack mouth of the pale baby when efforts have been abandoned. The mother and father's screams. The infant gear lying untidily tossed in the labor room, reflecting the chaos of the last minutes before it all went wrong. The list of who to call when the baby is here that sits on the bedside table untouched. The onesies, the lactation pillow. All of the dreams for this baby manifested on a single stainless steel hospital cart for transport back to a quiet home. And somehow we move forward, but we're never the same. So why share this? What's the point? This is the question one member of our congregation asked me, and it's a good one. Perhaps it's a matter of good news/bad news. Perhaps it's to help people understand that in any medical disaster, there is a second victim. This is actually all over the literature. There's lots of good literature on the second victim. It's the medical team that needs help and support, albeit in a different way than do the mother and father and the family. But to me, most importantly, the experience of loss and failure is part of the transcendental or sublime nature of the intersection between medicine and spirituality. Palliative care physicians, as well as hospice care nurses, death doulas, hospital chaplains, and really many others involved in providing medical and spiritual care to dying people and their families, are especially trained, often, in how to manage their own emotional and spiritual state in their work. This is not a focus of medical education for obstetricians and midwives. We don't talk about it because it's hard. I can barely get through this reading, honestly. I would argue that one of the few ways to understand and get through these experiences is to recognize their transcendence, that death is a normal part of the human experience, and so it's part of the story. But then there are the miracle saves. We talked about one in the beginning. I solicited birth stories from my friends on Facebook, and this one I'm about to read stood out as an excellent example of transcendence. I edited the following to provide some anonymity. For context, what is described here is called the shoulder dystocia. That's where the head comes out, but then the shoulders get stuck, and there's techniques that you learn. We'll get there. One of the true obstetrical emergencies, we all learn it. Trained very thoroughly on it. We do drills on shoulder dystocias because it's a fairly common thing. Usually it's no big deal, but sometimes it's a very big deal. So no matter how much you train and drill, it's still a scary thing to have happening in real time. Here's the story. It took a while for me to get pregnant, but once I was, my pregnancy went off pretty easily. The birth was planned as an attempted water birth, but it did not go as expected. My labor progressed quickly as my water broke at 3 p.m. and I was at the hospital around 5 p.m. Most of my laboring was done in a birthing tub. Once the baby's head was delivered, it became obvious to the nurse and midwife that he was not coming out easily. He was face up, most babies are supposed to be face down, and clearly had his shoulders spread wide. They called all the nursing staff in to assist, and since it was shift change, there were a lot of extra hands on deck. That's a blessing. I was removed from the birthing tub by the nurses and carried to a bed where they performed techniques to get him out as fast as they could. As there were many nurses on the floor, at that time, there were many hands who were able to assist in the resuscitation. It took 13 minutes to resuscitate him. He had APGAR scores of 0, 0, and 1, and that would be at like 1, 5, and 10 minutes. 0 means no heartbeat, no breathing, pale, blue, not alive, right? Not alive. So at 1 and 5 minutes, that was the case. This is just all on the side, not on the story. So at 1 and 5 minutes, there's nothing to show that this baby was alive. And at 10 minutes, there was a 1. So one thing, maybe there's a little color, there might have been a little heartbeat, no cry at that point because baby was intubated. And so that's what you have to do. You have to get some oxygen in, and they managed to do that after 10 minutes. She goes on to say, after just a few minutes of being intubated, he started breathing over the tube. He was then brought to the special care nursery and, 3.5 hours later, transferred to a specialty hospital for hypothermic cooling, which was performed for 72 hours to help prevent further injury to the brain. He did have 2 seizures during that time, which were treated with phenobarbital. An MRI was performed and looked clear, but the neurologist warned us that the MRI was just a starting point and didn't necessarily predict the future for him. It felt really scary when we left the hospital. They told us to go home and love him just like we would any other baby. We were not given much hope, but were given numbers and contacts and people to reach out to, should we have any questions. 8 years later, here we are. Our son loves to dance, sing, and go to church. He loves to learn his favorite subject, which is math. The outcome of his injury is that he has dyspraxia and dyslexia. These are very mild compared to what we could have seen. Many providers we see call him a miracle after reading his medical records from his birth. I would agree. The pediatric specialist told us our hospital did everything right, that our doctors and our nurses and anesthetists and everyone did everything right. Well, I know that science led them in the right direction. I know that miracles happen, and I do feel he is one. So. Other people responded to my request for stories with both humorous and serious anecdotes. One respondent explained that her illusion of control was shattered when she developed a life-threatening blood pressure problem called preeclampsia and needed a cesarean section. Physician/hospital births tend on average to be more difficult and complicated due to the transfer of care when a planned midwife or home birth becomes too high risk or doesn't go as planned. So we kind of picked up the problems, not all the easy stuff. This is what we're trained for, so that's fine. And there really is something to, I mean, if you ask any labor nurse about a patient's birth plan, she'll say, well, you know, the longer the birth plan, the higher chance of a cesarean section. It's a joke, but it's kind of, it's one of these semi-jokes, you know? Like, people need, it's nice to have a plan for when you're going into labor, but it's also nice to recognize that that is going to change. It always does, it always changes. So, so it was vitally important for not only parents-to-be, but also the medical team to recognize that we have to take things as they come and that we're not genuinely in control. Sometimes, and in fact almost always, the outcomes are good, but sometimes they're not. And in either case, all we can really do in the end is accept. The inspiration for today's talk is my own experiences, both good and bad. There's just something about the moment when all the work and pain and mess and effort and sometimes stitching is over and the newborn is on mom's chest. The pictures have been taken and sent off to social media or anxiously awaiting family members, and there's finally a moment of quiet. The picture in my head, and this is most of the times exactly like this, the picture in my head is of mom holding her baby, all swaddled up. Her partner or family member leans in close, unable to ever get close enough to this tiny miracle, this brand new human being. This tiny person who just made a woman a mother, a couple a family, an older child a sibling, a parent, a grandparent, the government a statistic, and an obstetrician fulfilled. I thank the family for letting me be part of their amazing birth experience and turn away out the door for paperwork and on to the next adventure. And I thank you all for listening to me today.